Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at the 1860 snapshot, the making of a pioneer. You know, we often think of history as this grand, sweeping narrative, right? But honestly, sometimes the absolute best stories are tucked away in the most mundane places imaginable. So we're skipping the traditional agenda today and jumping straight into a mystery that's literally hiding in plain sight. We're going to look at a single, solitary line from an 1860 census record. On the surface, sure, it's just a quick snapshot of a young guy living on the American frontier. But as we start to peel back the layers, oh man, we're going to uncover a hidden life full of grueling labor, a complete whirlwind of a romance, and a deeply complicated family secret. Okay, let's dive into this number right here, $1,232. Now, in 1860, this was an absolutely massive amount of personal wealth. But what makes it a genuine mystery is who it actually belonged to. See, according to the census, this money belonged to a 21-year-old farm laborer named Devier James Lamphere Smith. Think about that for a second. How on earth does a young farmhand, a guy who is supposedly just out there working the fields all day, scrape together such a massive pile of cash? Well, that is exactly the curiosity gap we're going to bridge today. And honestly, the answer reveals so much about how the American West was actually built.
So, let's set the stage with Section 1, setting the 1860 scene in Dodge County, Wisconsin.
To really wrap our heads around Devier's wealth, we first have to understand the world he was living in. Wisconsin had just officially become a state a few years prior, in 1848. So by 1860, Dodge County wasn't just some wild, untamed frontier anymore. It was a seriously prosperous agricultural region. You had these beautiful, rolling prairie lands being rapidly scooped up and settled by folks moving out from New York and New England. But here's the real game changer. The area was getting physically connected. They were laying down these new plank roads, and the newly arriving railroads were just completely flipping commerce and travel on its head across southern Wisconsin. This place was rapidly modernizing into a super busy, bustling hub.
Which brings us to Section 2, the 4 Mile Inn, our crossroads of commerce. Right smack in the middle of this booming hub was the epicenter of Devier's daily life. And the contrast in wealth you're about to see is just fascinating. So Rancelow Smith, that's Devier's father, was a highly successful innkeeper. He had an impressive $7,800 in real property, meaning his land and buildings. But look over at the personal property column. This is liquid cash, goods, stuff like that. Rancelow has $930. Meanwhile, Devier, the young 21-year-old kid who's supposedly just a field worker, has over $1,200. He actually amassed more personal liquid wealth than his highly successful father. I mean, it just doesn't add up for a simple farmhand, does it?
Well, here is the truth that was hiding right behind the paperwork. That official census label? It completely missed the boat on the reality of Devier's life. He wasn't just some hired hand. He was basically an apprentice innkeeper and the guy managing a massive livery stable operation. The 4 Mile Inn was sitting perfectly at this strategic crossroads connecting Milwaukee to Madison and Wausau to Watertown. If you were a traveler, a drover, or moving commercial freight, it was a mandatory stop. And Devier? He was the guy running the engine of that entire operation.
You have to remember, horse traffic in 1860 Wisconsin was literally the lifeblood of regional commerce. Let's try to picture Devier's typical day. The guy is up way before dawn. At first light, he's out there feeding, watering, and mucking out stalls. Then he's constantly haggling and negotiating rates with travelers. He's managing the hiring out of horses and rigs. He's sizing up the temperament of visiting horses. He's even running out to meet the arriving trains to transfer passengers and their luggage. This was an exhausting, physically grueling, and super commercial role. It completely explains how he raked in that huge amount of personal wealth. In fact, he spent so much time dealing with tack and equipment that decades later, in 1885, he actually patented his very own design for a harness rack.
But wait, because we can't forget, he was still a farmer too. So alongside all that intense daily livery stuff, Devier's life was also totally dictated by the agricultural rhythm of the year. Spring meant heavy plowing and planting that rich Dodge County soil for wheat. Summer was all about cultivation and haying. And autumn? That meant the harvest and the unbelievably long, tedious work of preparing stores for those brutal Wisconsin winters. Juggling this heavy farm labor with the super fast-paced commercial environment of the inn forged him into one incredibly capable young man.
Let's shift gears a bit. Section 3, Courtship and Community, Finding Abigail Vox. Now, Devier's life wasn't exclusively about plowing fields and negotiating horse trades. Rolling Prairie was this really tight-knit world of transplanted New York families, and while the social scene was a bit limited, it was incredibly lively. We're talking church gatherings, community dances, the big agricultural fairs. But honestly, the absolute biggest social hub of all was the 4 Mile Inn itself.
As the guy visibly running the livery, Devier would have been known to basically everyone for miles around, and it was right there, right in the middle of that bustling social scene, that he caught the eye of a young woman named Abigail Voss.
I gotta tell you, Devier and Abby were basically a frontier match made in heaven. They both had this incredibly practical, sharp intelligence. We already know how capable Devier was as a manager, while Abby was just as fiercely resourceful. We actually know from a later 1875 Kansas census that she was an expert milliner, which is a highly skilled trade making hats. These were two young people who absolutely knew how to roll up their sleeves, work hard, and rely on their own practical skills to build a life.
And their connection? It was undeniable, and it moved incredibly fast. During that 1860 census, they were already deep in courtship. Fast forward just a few months to April 4th of 1861, and they are officially married. Exactly a year after that, in April 1862, they welcomed their very first child, Abby Ardell, who they called Della. I mean, in the blink of an eye, our young farm laborer transformed into a husband, a father, and a man who was ready to take on the world.
But here's the twist. Section 4, a complicated identity, the secret of the Smith family. Because right beneath the surface of this prosperous, highly visible life, there was a deeply complicated personal reality. You really have to stop and ask, who was Devier Smith, really? While everyone in Rolling Prairie knew this capable young man running the livery, his actual legal identity was entirely ambiguous. Devier was holding on to a secret, and pretty soon he was going to be forced to confront it publicly.
In 1866, Devier's father, Ranslow, sat down and wrote out his will. And in that document, he used this absolutely gut-wrenching phrasing. He wrote, "Devier J. Lamphere, commonly called Devier J. Smith, my adopted son." Devier was adopted. That name, Smith, the very identity he'd spent years building his entire reputation on at the 4 Mile Inn, it wasn't legally his. And with Ranslow putting his affairs in order, Devier's legal status as an heir was suddenly thrown into jeopardy.
But remember who we're talking about here. Devier wasn't the kind of guy to just sit back and let things happen to him. No way. He took massive action. He went straight to the top and took the extraordinary step of petitioning the Wisconsin State Senate directly for a formal name change and a declaration of heirship. It actually required an official legislative act signed by Governor Lucius Fairchild on March 21, 1866, for Devier to finally, legally secure the name he had literally been using his entire life. And you know what's really wild about all this? Even today, his exact origins are still unresolved. Modern DNA evidence points strongly to a connection with the Lamphere family over in Jefferson County, New York, but the true identity of his birth parents? Total mystery. But honestly, for Devier, I don't think it mattered, because his true identity wasn't rooted in bloodlines or biology. It was rooted in the community he served, the sweat equity he put into that inn, and the loving family he built with Ranslow, Mary, and his wife Abby. Let's bring it all together now in Section 5, the westward threshold, forged on the frontier. See, every single thing Devier experienced back in 1860 acted as a perfect springboard for his future. Within just a decade of that census, Devier would own his own land in Iowa. He'd go on to operate his own independent livery stables. He would use that expert eye he developed for judging horseflesh to trade cattle and horses, eventually leading his own family on this massive westward migration across Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Every skill he honed down at the 4 Mile Inn prepared him absolutely perfectly for the expansion of the American West. It's just amazing to think about. How does a single line on an 1860 census, a line that flat-out incorrectly labels a man as just a farm laborer, actually give us the exact blueprint of an American pioneer? Behind that one tiny data point was a master of frontier commerce, an adoptive son fighting to secure his own name, and a man forging his very own destiny. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What incredible, rich, deeply human histories are hiding in the simple data of your own family tree, just waiting for you to uncover them. Thanks so much for watching The Explainer, and we'll see you next time.